August 1996, a record store in San Francisco. A teenage metalhead stands in the new release section holding the latest Metallica album in his hands. He stares at the cover in confusion. No black, no jagged logos, no leather or chains. Instead, a photograph of blood and bodily fluids mixed together by Andres Serrano, the same artist who created Piss Christ. The kid flips the album over, scans the song titles, then puts it back on the shelf and walks out empty-handed. Across America, thousands of fans are doing the same thing. The band that defined an entire generation of heavy music has just released something their own audience does not recognize. This is the story of Load, the album that nearly destroyed Metallica. 6 strings, 6 risks, 6 moments that fractured the Metallica empire. To understand how catastrophic the Load era was, you have to understand what Metallica meant to metal fans before 1996. Between 1983 and 1988, Metallica released 4 albums that invented a blueprint for an entire generation. Kill 'Em All arrived in 1983 as a declaration of war against mainstream rock. The songs were fast, aggressive, and technically demanding. Hit the Lights and Seek and Destroy established a sound built on speed and precision. There were no power ballads, no radio singles, no compromise. The band operated with an us versus them mentality that separated them from every other metal act trying to chase MTV airplay. They were pure. Ride the Lightning followed in 1984 and proved the debut was not a fluke. Fade to Black introduced acoustic elements and showed the band could write with emotional depth, but the core remained uncompromising thrash. The album balanced melody with aggression in ways that expanded the genre without diluting. Master of Puppets arrived in 1986 and became the genre-defining statement. The title track was an 8-minute epic about addiction that combined classical music structure with relentless heaviness. Battery opened with acoustic guitar before exploding into one of the fastest songs the band ever recorded. This was thrash metal at its peak. Complex, angry, uncompromising, the band toured relentlessly, built a fan base through word of mouth and tape trading, and refused to make videos for MTV. They were everything corporate rock was not. Then bassist Cliff Burton died in a bus crash in Sweden during the Master of Puppets tour. The loss devastated the band, but they pushed forward, and Justice for All arrived in 1988 as the most technically ambitious album they ever attempted. The songs were longer, more intricate, and angrier than anything they had done before. One clocked in at nearly 10 minutes. The production was deliberately harsh, with the bass mixed so low it was almost inaudible. This was not an accident. This was a band rejecting polish and accessibility. They were still operating as a sealed unit, and the metal community worshipped them for it. Fans did not just love Metallica for the music. They loved them for the purity of their refusal to bend. But something was shifting beneath the surface. By 1990, the band was exhausted. They had spent the better part of a decade on the road, playing to increasingly larger crowds, and they were beginning to feel confined by the expectations that came with being thrash metal heroes. James Hetfield was writing riffs that were slower and heavier instead of faster and more complex. Lars Ulrich was listening to bands outside of metal and becoming interested in expanding their sound. Kirk Hammett was exploring Lou's influences. The band collectively began to feel that thrash metal, as they had defined it, had run its course. They wanted room to grow. They wanted to prove they were more than a one-dimensional speed metal band. They hired producer Bob Rock, who had worked with Motley Crue and Bon Jovi, 2 bands that represented everything Metallica had stood against. The Black Album arrived in August 1991 and changed everything. Enter Sandman was the lead single, and it was unlike anything Metallica had released before. The tempo was mid-paced. The riff was simple and hypnotic instead of fast and intricate. The song was built for arenas and radio play. The album was produced with a clarity and polish that made Justice sound like a demo tape. Every instrument was perfectly balanced. The drums had space to breathe. Hetfield's vocals were pushed forward in the mix. The songs were shorter, more focused, and designed to connect with audiences beyond the thrash metal underground. The metal community reacted with immediate suspicion. Accusations of selling out filled the pages of metal magazines. Fans debated whether the band had betrayed their principles or simply matured, but the album was undeniable. Enter Sandman became the biggest metal song in history. Nothing Else Matters, a power ballad with orchestral strings, became a crossover hit that reached audiences who had never listened to heavy music before. Sad But True and Wherever I May Roam proved the band could still write heavy songs even at slower tempos. The Black Album sold 30 million copies worldwide. Metallica became the biggest metal band on the planet, and it was not even close. The fan base fractured, but most stayed loyal because the sound, while more accessible, still felt rooted in heavy metal identity. The songs were slower, but they were still heavy. The production was polished, but the riffs were still massive. Hetfield's voice still carried aggression. This was not a betrayal. This was evolution, or at least that is what the band and their remaining fans told themselves. The Black Album was the crack in the dam, not the flood, but the flood was coming. Between 1991 and 1993, Metallica toured the world relentlessly. They played stadiums, they headlined festivals, they became a cultural phenomenon that transcended metal. But success brought new pressures and new problems. Hetfield was drinking heavily. The rigors of touring and the constant scrutiny were taking a toll on his mental health. Lars Ulrich was increasingly interested in art, fashion, and cultural spaces outside of metal. He wanted Metallica to be more than just a a heavy band. He wanted them to be important in the broader sense, to be taken seriously by critics who dismissed metal as juvenile noise. Kirk Hammett was listening to blues records and exploring influences that had nothing to do with thrash. Jason Newsted, who had replaced Cliff Burton in 1986, felt creatively marginalized. He was not allowed to contribute songwriting in meaningful ways, and the band treated him more like a hired musician than a full member. By 1994, the tension inside Metallica was beginning to show. The band entered the studio with Bob Rock to begin writing their follow-up to the Black Album, and the sessions immediately revealed how far they had drifted from their thrash roots. The riffs Hetfield was writing were slow, bluesy, and groovy. There were no speed-picking sections, no intricate tempo changes, no double bass drum patterns. The songs sounded closer to Soundgarden and Alice in Chains than anything on Master of Puppets. The band was listening to alternative rock, southern rock, and even country music. They were deliberately trying to shed the skin of thrash metal, and then they cut their hair. In the grand scheme of artistic decisions, a haircut should not matter. But in the metal community of the mid-90s, it mattered enormously. Long hair was not just a style choice. It was a symbol of rebellion, of commitment to the outsider identity that defined heavy music. When Metallica showed up with short hair, wearing eyeliner and leather pants that looked more glam than thrash, it felt like a visual announcement that they were leaving metal behind. Fans saw the pictures in magazines before they heard a single note of new music, and the reaction was immediate. This was not evolution. This was abandonment. The writing sessions for what would become Load stretched across 18 months and produced 27 songs. None of them sounded like classic Metallica. The band was intentionally stripping away the aggression and complexity that had defined their sound. Bob Rock encouraged them to embrace space, groove, and melody. The songs were longer, but not in the progressive sense that Justice had been long. These were slow burns built on repetition and mood, rather than technical precision. Hetfield was writing lyrics that were more introspective and less focused on social or political themes. He was exploring personal themes, but he was doing it in ways that felt subdued rather than explosive. The band believed they were maturing. The metal world saw betrayal brewing. Load was released in June 1996, and the backlash was instant and brutal. The album cover alone became a flashpoint. Andres Serrano had created the image by mixing his own blood and semen, then photographing. The result was an abstract swirl of red and amber that looked nothing like a metal album cover. There were no skulls, no flames, no gothic imagery. It looked like modern art, which is exactly what it was. Conservative audiences were disgusted. Metal purists were confused. The band insisted the cover was a bold, artistic statement, but to many fans it felt like a deliberate provocation, a middle finger to the community that had built them. Then people actually listened to the album. Until It Sleeps was the lead single, and the music video, directed by Samuel Bayer, featured surreal imagery inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. The song itself was melodic, mid-tempo, and built around clean guitar tones and vocal harmonies. It sounded closer to grunge than metal. There was no thrash, no speed, no aggression. Ain't My Bitch, the opening track, had a swaggering groove that sounded like Aerosmith. King Nothing was a radio-friendly anthem with a sing-along chorus. Hero of the Day was a melancholic ballad with slide guitar. Mama Said was a country-influenced song with pedal steel guitar. Country. On a Metallica album, metal magazines published scathing reviews. Fans burned Metallica shirts at concerts. Radio stations that had built their identity on thrash refused to play the singles. Online message boards, still in their infancy in 1996, exploded with anger. The consensus among longtime fans was clear. Metallica had sold out. They had abandoned the sound that made them legends in pursuit of mainstream acceptance and radio play. The band had betrayed the people who believed in them when they were playing clubs and sleeping on floors. But here is the twist. Load was not a commercial failure. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It sold enormous numbers in its first week and went on to sell 5 million copies in the United States alone. The singles charted, the tours sold out. By every conventional metric, Load was a success. But commercial success and cultural acceptance are not the same thing. Metallica had won the mainstream and lost their soul connection with the audience that made them matter. The album sold millions but felt like a funeral for the band that fans had loved. Metallica publicly insisted they did not care about the backlash. Lars Ulrich gave interviews dismissing fan complaints as closed-minded and regressive. He argued that the band had every right to evolve and that fans who wanted them to keep making the same album over and over were missing the point of art. James Hetfield echoed these sentiments, saying the band was proud of Load and that it represented their most honest work. But internal interviews conducted years later reveal a different story. The band was deeply frustrated and wounded by the rejection. They had expected criticism, but they had not anticipated the level of vitriol and the sense of personal betrayal that came from their own unity. The long-term consequences of Load were immediate and severe. Metallica doubled down by releasing Reload in November 1997, just 16 months after Load. The second album was essentially part 2 of the same sessions, featuring the remaining songs that had not fit on the first record. Reload sounded almost identical to Load. The same groovy, bluesy, alternative rock-influenced sound, the same stripped-down production, the same lack of thrash elements. If Load had been presented as a one-time experiment, fans might have eventually forgiven it. But Reload made it clear this was not an experiment. This was the new Metallica. This was permanent. The backlash intensified. Fans who had given the band the benefit of the doubt Load now felt completely alienated. The metal community moved on. Younger thrash bands like Slayer and Pantera were still delivering uncompromising aggression, and fans flocked to them instead. Metallica was still selling records and playing arenas, but they were no longer the band that defined heavy music. They had become something else, a mainstream rock band with a metal past. The cultural relevance they had spent a decade building evaporated in less than 2 years. Then came the Napster lawsuit in 2000. Metallica sued the file-sharing service for copyright infringement, and the public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Fans accused the band of being greedy and out of touch. The lawsuit became a symbol of corporate overreach and artist greed. Combined with the Load and Reload era, it created a narrative that Metallica had completely lost their way. They were no longer the rebellious outsiders fighting against the system. They were the system. By 2001, the band was in crisis. Jason Newsted quit, citing creative frustration and the toxic internal dynamics of the band. James Hetfield entered rehab for alcohol addiction. The remaining members hired a therapist to help them navigate their dysfunction, and the entire process was documented in the 2004 film Some Kind of Monster. The documentary showed a band on the verge of collapse. Hetfield and Ulrich could barely communicate without arguing. The creative process was painful and uncertain. The band that had once operated as a sealed unit of shared purpose was now a collection of damaged individuals trying to remember why they started making music in the first place. Saint Anger arrived in 2003 as an attempt to return to aggression and rawness, but the album was widely panned for its awful production and lack of guitar solos. The snare drum sound became a punchline. The songs felt unfocused and incomplete. If Load had been a betrayal, Saint Anger was a disaster. Metallica had spent 7 years trying to redefine themselves, and the result was 2 commercially successful but culturally rejected albums, followed by one that almost everyone agreed was terrible. It took another 5 years for the band to stabilize. Death Magnetic arrived in 2008 and was deliberately designed to win back the thrash metal audience. The songs were faster, longer, and more aggressive. The production, handled by Rick Rubin, attempted to recapture the raw energy of the 80s albums. The album was well received by fans who had been waiting 2 decades for Metallica to sound like Metallica again. Hardwired to Self-Destruct followed in 2016 and continued the return to thrash. The band had survived. They remained one of the biggest rock acts in the world, but they never fully repaired the trust they broke in 1996. Something unexpected happened around 2015. Younger fans who grew up after the Load era started revisiting the album without the baggage of betrayal. These listeners had no emotional investment in what Metallica was supposed to sound like. They heard Load as a standalone record, and many of them liked it. Music critics began writing retrospective pieces arguing that Load was actually a brave and underrated album that showcased range and emotional depth the band had never explored before. The album was reframed not as a sellout, but as an honest artistic risk that was punished because it violated an unspoken contract between Metallica and their fans. Then in 2016, James Hetfield gave an interview where he admitted something that recontextualized the entire Load era. He said that during the mid-90s, he was drinking so heavily that he could not access the anger that had fueled the early albums. The aggression that defined Metallica's sound was gone because he was numbing himself to avoid dealing with his pain. Load was not a calculated betrayal. It was a document of emotional collapse. The album that fans rejected for not being heavy enough was actually a record about heaviness the band could not express thrash anymore. The music was slow, not because they sold out, but because they were falling apart. 6 strings, 6 risks, 6 moments that fractured the Metallica empire. The decision to cut their hair, the Andres Serrano album cover, the complete removal of thrash elements, the inclusion of country and blues influences, the public dismissal of fan complaints, the release of Reload 16 months later. Each choice compounded the damage. Each one pushed the band further from the community that built them. Load is still the most divisive album in Metallica's catalog 30 years after its release. Some fans have come around, others never will. The album did not end Metallica's career, but it ended the version of Metallica that millions of people love. It revealed the impossible tension between artistic growth and audience loyalty. Metallica wanted freedom. Their fans wanted consistency. Both sides had legitimate claims. Nobody won. The band survived and remains commercially dominant, but the cultural wound from 1996 never fully healed. Load stands as proof that a band can evolve, succeed, and still lose something irreplaceable in the process. Whether that was courage or cowardice depends on which side of the divide you stand on, and we are still arguing about it.